I do not know why some fathers crave sons as if daughters are a curse, as if our existence is a burden rather than a blessing. I do not know why a man's heart, meant to protect and cherish, can harden like dry earth, cracking under the weight of his own misguided desires. But I know pain, the kind that does not just wound but lingers, sinking deep into the soul like a cold, endless night. I have felt it in the way his eyes passed over me as though I were invisible, in the silence that stretched between us like a vast, unbridgeable river. I have carried it in my chest like a heavy stone, pressing against my ribs with every breath, yet refusing to be cast away. It is the sorrow of being unwanted, the grief of knowing that no matter how much love I had to give, it would never be enough to soften the heart that should have been my first home. My name is Temi, and this is the story of how my sister and I were cast away like broken calabashes, unwanted, unloved, discarded by the very man whose blood runs through our veins. We were not born weak, yet in his eyes, we were worthless, as if being daughters made us less than human. We tried to be enough, to carve a place in his hardened heart, but no matter how brightly we shone, he refused to see our light. And so, on a night when the moon hung in the sky like a silent witness, we were sent away, our feet bare, our hands empty, our hearts heavy with questions that had no answers. But fate, though cruel in its first embrace, was not done with us. For though we walked into the darkness as forsaken children, we would rise, like the sun that no man can command to set forever. Before I was born, my father had already decided who I was meant to be. He dreamed of a son, strong, fearless, a boy who would walk beside him in the fields, learning the art of the hunt, carrying firewood on his small but steady back, and growing into the man who would one day inherit all that he had built. When my mother was heavy with me, he spoke to her belly as if willing a son into existence. This one will be different, he would say, his voice thick with hope. This one will be my legacy. He imagined a boy running at his heels, a child with his strength, his name, his pride. And so, when I entered this world with soft cries and small, delicate hands, his joy turned to silence. I was not the child he had waited for. I was not his dream. Though my mother rejoiced at my birth, cradling me in her arms like the treasure I was meant to be, my father barely looked at me. He turned away from my mother in disappointment, and though he never said it out loud, I could feel it in the way he distanced himself. The hands that should have carried me high in the air never reached for me. The voice that should have soothed me with lullabies never called me my child. I grew up watching him from afar, always hoping for his love, but he remained cold. And when my mother carried another child, his hope rekindled. This one will be my son, he told everyone. The gods cannot be so cruel twice. I heard the excitement in his voice, a sound I had never known him to have for me. But when Ife was born, another girl with bright, searching eyes, something inside my father broke. His disappointment became deeper, heavier, something he carried with him like a curse. He did not just turn away from us, he turned against fate itself. His words became sharper, his presence heavier with unspoken grief. It was as if he no longer saw us as his children but as the cruel tricks of a God who had denied him his one true desire. And from that moment on, we were no longer simply his daughters. We were his burden, a reminder of what he would never have. Our father, Baba Ogunde, was a great hunter, a man whose name alone could make wild beasts tremble and whose presence commanded respect across Ajibode. His wealth was vast, his yam barns stretched as far as the eye could see, his cattle roamed freely under the golden sun, and his compound was a fortress of prosperity. The villagers spoke his name with admiration, yet beneath all his riches, his heart was a barren land, dry and lifeless, untouched by the warmth of love. For all his strength, for all his victories in the wild, he was defeated by one thing, a longing for a son that consumed him like a slow-burning fire. He saw our births not as blessings, but as wounds fate had inflicted upon him. To have daughters was, in his eyes, a cruel joke played by the gods, a curse whispered into his destiny. He did not speak of this pain with sorrow, only with anger, as if our mere existence had stolen something from him. No matter how hard he fare and I tried to fill the void he claimed was in his soul, we remained invisible in the shadow of the son he never had. Ife wove the finest fabrics, hoping he would wear them with pride, but he never did. I sat by his feet, listening, memorizing his proverbs, trying to shape my voice to carry wisdom the way he wished a son's would. But he never looked at me the way a father should look at his child. His eyes held no warmth, only the quiet resentment of a man who believed fate had wronged him. "Who will carry my name when I am gone?" he would mutter, his voice laced with disappointment so deep it felt like a dagger to my chest. "Who will inherit all I have worked for?" He spoke as if we were not standing before him, as if the love we poured at his feet was not enough to matter. No matter what we did, no matter how much of ourselves we gave, we could never soften the stone that was his heart. We were his daughters, but never his pride. We were his blood, but never his legacy. And so, the weight of his rejection settled upon our shoulders like a cloak of sorrow, one we would carry for years to come. I still hear my mother's cries from that night. They echo in my mind like a song of sorrow that will never end, twisting through my dreams and leaving behind a pain that time cannot erase. The way she wept, her voice raw, breaking like waves against jagged rocks, was the sound of a heart being shattered. It was the sound of a mother losing her children, of love being torn from her arms with a cruelty too great to bear. Even now, I see her face, her eyes filled with terror, her hands trembling as they clutched at my father's ankles, begging for mercy. But mercy was not something my father had left to give. He had already buried it beneath his disappointment, beneath the weight of the sons he would never have. It was the night of the new moon festival, a night meant for joy and laughter, yet there was none in our home. The village danced and feasted beneath the stars, but in our compound, darkness sat heavily in the air. My father returned home early, his face drawn, his jaw clenched as if holding in a rage too great to contain. Ife and I stood before him, our backs straight, our hands folded in respect, hoping, praying that maybe this time, he would see us, not as burdens, but as his children. But when he spoke, his words cut deeper than any blade. "I have no use for daughters," he said, his voice like the crack of thunder before a storm. "Leave my house and do not return." There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt, just finality, as if we were nothing more than dust he had grown tired of sweeping away. My mother's sobs filled the night, her body collapsing before him as she begged, her hands gripping his feet like a drowning woman reaching for the shore. "My husband, please. They are your children." Her voice trembled with desperation, but he only shook her off, stepping away as if her touch burned him. And so, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the sorrow in our hearts, Ife and I walked away, our feet bare against the cold earth, our hands gripping each other as if letting go would mean vanishing into the night. The moon was full, casting its silver light upon the road ahead, but to us, there was no light, only an endless stretch of darkness, cold and unwelcoming, leading us away from the only home we had ever known. We walked for days, our bodies weak, our stomachs empty, and our hearts drowning in fear. Every step felt like an ache carved into our bones, a reminder that we no longer belonged anywhere. The forest loomed around us, its trees whispering in the night, but they did not welcome us. The rivers flowed, cold and relentless, but they did not comfort us. Even the wind, which carried our sorrow far beyond where we could see, did nothing to ease our pain. The world was silent, indifferent to the two forsaken girls wandering its vast emptiness, lost and unwanted. With every passing day, the weight of rejection pressed down on us, heavier than the hunger in our bellies. And yet, we walked. What else was there to do? There were nights when I could no longer hold back my sorrow, when the grief inside me spilled out in silent sobs, my small body shaking in the darkness. And every time, Ife held me close, her warmth the only thing keeping me from breaking apart. I could feel her own tears soaking into my hair, but she never let her voice tremble, never let me see the full depth of her pain. When my legs gave out, when my strength failed me, she lifted me onto her back, her arms trembling under my weight. "Tell me, we will survive," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear, her words a fragile promise she refused to break. She carried me when I could no longer walk, fed me when she had nothing to eat, and in the darkest moments, she became my light. And we did survive. In a faraway village, fate finally softened its cruel grip on us. A kind old weaver took Ife in, teaching her the secrets of fine fabrics. Her hands, which once trembled from exhaustion, learned to weave beauty from thread, and soon, she was known across the land, dressing kings and queens in garments as rich as the sun. As for me, I was taken in by an elder, a man of great wisdom who saw in me something my father never did. He taught me the ways of justice, of balance, of truth. Over time, people began to seek me out, calling me Oludejo, the one who brings justice. Years passed, and our names were no longer spoken in sorrow but in praise. We had risen, not because we were born with power, but because we refused to let rejection be the end of our story. Back in Ijibuod, time had stripped our father of the strength he once carried with pride. His wealth, once the envy of many, had become meaningless in his loneliness. His young barns still stood, but there was no son to inherit them. His cattle still roamed, but there was no child to call them his own. The mighty hunter who once walked with his head high now sat alone in a house that had become a prison of silence. The echoes of laughter that once filled his compound had long faded, leaving only the ghost of his regrets. He had spent his life craving a son, yet in the end, he had nothing. No hands to hold him in his old age, no voices to call him Baba with love. Only the cold embrace of solitude. One evening, as the sun cast golden shadows across the village, a royal procession entered Ijibuod. The beating of drums filled the air, announcing the arrival of guests of great importance. Villagers rushed to see who had come with such splendor, their eyes widening in awe as two powerful women stepped forward. Their robes shimmered in the fading light, their heads held high, their presence commanding. It was us. The daughters who had once been cast away like broken calabashes had returned, not as outcasts, but as women of honor, women whose names carried weight far beyond the walls of the village that had once watched them live in disgrace. Gasps filled the air. Mothers pulled their daughters closer, whispering our names with pride, their eyes filled with wonder and admiration. When our father saw us, his body trembled, and with a heavy sob, he fell to his knees. The mighty hunter, the man who had once turned us away without a second thought, now wept like a child before us. His voice broke as he clutched his chest, his face etched with sorrow. "Forgive me," he whispered, his words barely louder than the wind. I was blind. I did not see your worth. Ife, ever gentle, knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. A father's love should not be measured by the gender of his children, she said softly. I knelt too, though my heart still ached from wounds too deep to forget. It is never too late to see with the heart, I told him, though in my soul, I knew the truth, love should not have to be earned. It should be given freely. That night, for the first time in years, my father's house was filled with warmth again. Laughter and music replaced the silence, and for a moment, it seemed as though the past could be washed away. But in my heart, I carried the lesson that life had taught me: love given too late is a sorrow of its own. A child, whether male or female, is a blessing. Those who reject love in pursuit of misplaced desires may find themselves alone in their greatest time of need.